There's one thing you need to know about this episode with the Royal Foundry. No, there are actually two things. First, you need to know that Beth, one half of the band, was not part of the conversation, unfortunately. Actually, three things. Okay, first, the Royal Foundry is essentially a husband and wife band, partners band, like other current Canadian modern rock staples, Dear Rouge or July Talk, which is also a lot of Alberta representation and a rabbit hole for another day. Second, in Beth's absence, the conversation is with Jared Salte. And the third thing you should know is that if you picture a permanent, warm, hospitable smile on Jared's face throughout the episode, you will have pretty much nailed it. Okay, four things. You should know what this band has accomplished. The Royal Foundry was formed in 2013 as a folk rock duo and made an immediate impact with the release of All We Have. After changing gears into the modern alt rock space in 2015, they haven't looked back with 4 studio albums, over half a dozen charting singles on alternative rock radio in Canada, including current top 20 hit Famous. Their songs have appeared on Disney, MTV, and the NHL. These would all be great reasons for Jared to be smiling, except the couple was still in the throes of an 18-month displacement from their home after a fire in their studio space, during which they experienced the birth of their first child and the recording of their latest album, Be Kind. But the smile was still there, and I didn't doubt its authenticity once. The episode was recorded from the basement of Jared's parents' house. There are audio challenges, moving furniture above, but we were still able to get through it and get to the heart of things. And, okay, a fifth thing you should know. This band is resilient. They are still okay. My name is Glen Erickson. This is Almost Famous Enough. Thank you for spending your time with us. This is the Royal Foundry. So I'm not even sure the last time we crossed paths. I don't know if it was, I was talking to my daughter. She remembers us seeing you at Taste of Edmonton. And I know we went to one of those, and I know we talked to you briefly at the side. I can't remember another time since then. But what I was recalling was our intersection started 10 years ago. I can't even believe it's 10 years, right? Since the Peak Performance Project, when I got introduced to you guys as on that jury of deciding who got in, and which we'll talk about a bit. But so it's 10 years. It's a little more than 10 years since you guys formed, which means it's only a little more than 10 years since you even have been married, as you got married right off the bat. Is it a time when you're doing reflection like that? Are you thinking back on, it's been 10 years, getting sort of into those, I don't want to use the word nostalgic necessarily, but is there any sort of reflection going on about the last 10 years?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a decade. When you put it like that, it starts to, it creeped up on us totally. We felt like a fresh band for 10 years, and then you look back and you go, oh, it's 10 years. We're not fresh. We've been doing this a while, and we've released a few albums, but the nostalgia part is funny, because I feel like every album or single that we look back on, almost everyone, I go, I wouldn't have done that, or I wish I could fix that up. So there's nostalgia, but always happy to just be moving forward or doing something new.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Is artists probably get asked that question a lot, and I think a lot of artists, other than the live performances, we've moved on so significantly from songs and music and whatever was probably inspiring or pushing us forward at that time to where we are right now. I mean, until you get to be
I don't know, like Springsteen just came through and played
Yeah.
3 hours of songs or plus at his age. But you and I like first intersected like 10 years ago. I know I still remember it really well because I was very tapped into the provincial music scene in particular, which is part of where this development program came out of. I'd been sitting on hundreds of juries or awards, so I see people all the time. And it was rare that I got an application that I didn't know or didn't recognize or didn't see the name before. But I grew a pretty quick affinity because I felt there were a lot of similarities in your background and just aspects of your life plus career that I could really relate to. So I remember feeling excited about it. I obviously didn't control alone who got in or not to the program.
Yeah.
I thought what I would find really interesting is to sort of like dip back, if it's okay, and we can sort of talk our way through the timeline. I think you've got like 5 studio albums basically underneath you, right? I know only 4 showed up on Spotify because the first one isn't there.
Got buried.
It got buried, but
Yeah.
but interestingly, have you noticed that that video doesn't get buried? It lives forever on the internet.
Yeah.
It's like such a distinctly different version of you guys, but we can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like 5 studio albums by all outside appearances. Even if I'm to step back from how well I know both you and Beth and the band, outside appearances, 10-year trajectory, like 5 studio albums, like an awful lot of, like all of them have charting songs on the Canadian alt rock. I hear you an awful lot in Edmonton on Sonic, which is kind of a flagship still alt rock station for Canada, which is pretty significant. Multiple awards, cash prize things, the Songwriting Awards. You have a team around you of people that are pretty well known in the country for the work they do. So all accounts on the surface, right? That's pretty much a career artist thing. So I guess my first step past sort of the veneer of the things you list in a bio is the Royal Foundry, like how DIY your career has been and still seems to be in a lot of ways. And I think that's of real particular interest, I think, for people just knowing how you came to be and how you're still making things and the choices you're still making, and right down to either musicians too and stuff, right? Like I think your approach has been interesting. It's obvious to me visibly. I'd like to dig into sort of how that came in, where it came from, if that's all right.
Yeah, I mean, the DIY thing was always money related and just our expertise. Like I used to produce people. I would produce my friends' bands in junior high, little
Yep.
studio setup. And so it's just natural that we would record ourselves. And we've kept it that way up until this last album really is the first time that we ever handed the reins to someone else, with Ryan Worsley at Echo Plant. And we're very happy with that. But up until then, it was always the way we've done it. And I think it's funny because we are coming on 10 years, but I think, well, we are on 10 years, but I think DIY is more how everyone's doing it now. Like even the idea of a big budget music video is kind of out the window. It's better just to do like 20 TikTok videos and put your money there than, get your, spend $10,000 on a music video and get like 4,000 views.
Yeah.
So it just the whole industry's changed to DIY in a lot of ways.
Yeah, which is why I think it's important conversation to have, because again, it can appear that way on the surface, right? Like it's like I think they're making these videos themselves. It looks like they're on their roof. So, but the why, that also gets talked about a little bit, but I just don't think it always gets talked about to the degree of this is the reality of how things work and how they've shifted. Obviously, going back to the 2000s to 2010, you still had that element of like label money on the table and stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
And that stuff changing. I think people would be continually surprised how much artists that are charting artists that are consistently out there, like that they're, how much of it they're doing themselves. So I spoke with Dan Mangan, a Vancouver artist, and the very first thing I said, so what does your day consist of today? And it was going downstairs and sorting out his merch count and stuff after a couple shows. And I think people would be surprised he's still doing a merch count. But so let's go back, because I think it's interesting, because again, other perceptions and appearances of how maybe people, like, who knows where people came along and got on the journey with the Royal Foundry, right? And even going back to how I explained, it was a surprise to me, right? There wasn't a lot of people who flew under my radar back around 2013, 2014, at least in the provincial music scene. But that's not like, that's always what's interesting, is that you weren't under the radar. It looked like you're a brand new folk duo in 2014. But, the truth is that you grew up in this extremely musical family. I mean, you're sitting in your dad's basement and it's all guitars and studio speakers. And and that upbringing, I guess there's some things I'd love to dig into, and I don't know how much you want to dig into them. So it's like, I'll probably ask questions and you can skirt whatever you want to skirt. I don't care.
Cool.
I find it a little interesting and fascinating. Like, everybody has certain parts of their story that are probably very different than most. And so you growing up in a musical family, your dad was essentially a version of, it's different words we could use, right? But music ministry. But in an interesting way is that, there was that real Jesus music thing that happened across North America in the 70s, of bands that were just, for lack of a better term, the easiest stereotype is hippie looking movements that were kind of woven into this Jesus movement. And you had bands that would mix the two together. So they would get on a bus and they would go on their tours, but their tours were also kind of like preaching and doing a version of church work, married with kind of the attempt to achieve pretty authentic musical career and pretty relevant records or what have you. So that was your dad's history, right? And I remember, I'm a Western Canadian boy. I think I've told you this before. We might have talked about this, but
oh yeah, totally.
Yeah, I remember, because they would book in churches, and I remember your dad's show coming through, and the rock and roll show coming through, and booking in the church, and going and seeing all of that. So I guess one of my first immediate questions is, how does that impact you and your growing up around music? I think what a lot of people don't recognize is that growing up in a church, because you hear it with like the soul R&B singers in the States all the time, right? That they grew up in the church. It's the fact that it gives you opportunity where you, like, from a young age, to perform, to be in front of people, and then it gives you access to like instruments and other musicians that to play with. It's actually like builds a community, right? So I'm curious how that sort of started shaping you, and how you feel that's shaped even how that turned into a career for you.
Yeah, it was absolutely essential to my music education. Like, we would go on summer vacation, and at the same time my dad would do some churches in the US, and then have us come up on stage and sing a song with him, and you're 9 years old and you're so nervous, but it helps you just get comfortable with it, and that's a sort of pressure that I think most kids would never have to go through, but in a positive way, like overcoming that and sort of developing a skin of like, I don't care. Like, I just go up there, like, I'll never see these people again. just go for it.
But also a validation that goes with it. Like,
yeah, of course. Yeah. Like, if
everybody loves seeing the kids up there.
Why do we
singing.
play music? Like, there is an element that, unfortunately, I wish I just loved music, but there is an element that you want people to like it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the education too is huge when you think of church. Like, people pay money to go to band camp and send their kids there, and it's like a whole thing. But you have band camp every Sunday if you're in the worship band, right?
Yeah,
So it's
absolutely.
a lot of early experience.
Yeah. So, which obviously is what led to you. Like, I'm not saying like every musician parent is gonna, have offspring of, you know what I mean, who are gonna become musicians. Like, it's
Yeah,
not.
for sure.
It's just the same as, if your dad was a banker, it doesn't mean you're gonna have
Yeah,
this.
but it is the family
financial-
business in a way.
Yeah,
Like,
you definitely.
my sister was in
Yeah.
music too, and she's still teaching music, and yeah, it's just natural.
Yeah, it's definitely an exposure that probably most don't get, which probably, so that led to you pretty early in your teens, like working in studio and beginning to understand aspects
Totally.
like that,
Yeah.
and getting into a band that, again, most people probably don't see or wouldn't probably understand just how large the Christian/gospel music machine is, or even
Yeah, for
especially was like 15 years,
Yeah, it's
years
changed
ago,
quite a
and,
bit.
and before that, right? Of like the Newsboys, you said you were open, like I think your first band, like your
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
Junkyard Poets like a high school band, or was it post?
That was high school. I had a junior high band before that called the Zeds because we're Canadian, and then Junkyard Poets, and that was the first like little taste of a little bit of success. But yeah, that was a really great experimental sort of project for me.
Yeah, which I'm gonna guess teaches you a lot, right? Like coming through and coming up. Was this always the path for you as a result? Like family band, and then now you're striking out on your own. You're getting some of that validation you need to tell you whether or not you should even bother, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Along with all the typical soul crushing parts of it, I'm sure. But was this for you? Like, was this always the path?
I think so. Yeah, it was always going to be music. There was a period before I met Beth where my band Junkyard Poets was kind of fizzling out, and I was mainly just producing people. And at that point, I thought, oh, I'll just do producing, which nothing wrong with that. But I think when Beth and I got married, that really rekindled stuff as we started writing again. And then obviously, like, you being on the panel and doing the peak and everything with Alberta Music sort of got that fire in my belly again. It was like, oh, I can make my own music and
So you
release
got
it.
a sense of opportunity. So
Yeah.
So at that tail end, you meet Beth.
Yeah.
Was the playing music together always in the conversation? How did that evolve from out of a relationship to let's actually do a thing together?
Yeah. Well, the last Junkyard Poets album that I did, she helped write on, I think, one of the songs lyrically, and then that was kind of when we started tinkering, and that was maybe like 3 years into our relationship, and it just felt natural. Like when we released our folky Royal Foundry first album, there was no intention of really doing this. Everything sort of fell into place. Like we released this, it still would have been in some ways kind of like gospel music adjacent lyrically, and actually our first show was the Canadian Gospel Music Awards.
Yeah.
Just because I had friends from there from my previous band, and so we flew out there like a month after our honeymoon, and did our first show, which was like a live performance on a TV thing at the award show. And it's because of that video, like once again, like this was all stumbled. We weren't like trying to promote ours. It was just weird. But it was because of that video that we were able to submit a live performance video to Alberta Music. And then from there, everything sort of just naturally fell into place.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting, right? Because a lot of bands starting out, And then they start to figure out, like, what do I need to do? Like, now that I'm making music and I want to do something with it, they start asking questions, and then they'll either come across some version of something they have to apply for, and then they get asked for these pieces. So, I mean, the fact that you already knew your way around the studio to get music made yourself obviously put you in the driver's seat with that.
Yeah.
I think the GMA thing is pretty interesting too. Obviously, it feels probably like those little lightning bolt moments that, you know, I think a lot of bands need. Like, if it was 100% just slogging it, it's hard to find the validation you need. You sort of you need a couple of lightning strikes to really feel like, is there anything of substance? And so you have this GMA experience, which, again, going back to that validation thing, must have been humongous. If you're like, let's just do this thing, but then all of a sudden people start paying attention right away, I guess. Yeah. And so then the part of your story sort of moves, and this is where I start to see a move, and I'm interested whether that's how you see it or how you experienced it too, right? Where this quick success happened, which probably gives you some motivation to keep going and trying some things. Out of all those things, the one I know that happened was you obviously caught wind of this Peak Performance project, which is a weird thing, right? Where it's this artist development program, plus it's a giant radio cash prize, and they're married together. Which of those was really the thing that you were after that first time, that first go around?
Obviously the cash.
And for those who aren't familiar, it was $100K basically to the first place winner, 75 to the second, and 50 to the third.
Yeah.
And there was only, well, eventually down to 12, I think, at that first one, maybe 15 bands out of Alberta competing. So if you got chosen, your probabilities were really good.
Not bad.
Yeah.
It was a total Hail Mary. Like, there was no part of me that expected to get it. It was just like, submit, and I completely forgot about it. And then one day, you know, we see the thing.
Yeah.
And we were shocked, especially because we were coming from, well, like gospel music, you know, and not that it wasn't overtly Christian or anything like that, but there was a bit of that tinge. So we weren't sure.
Yeah. Do you feel though, let's just go down that sidebar for a sec, because it's really interesting to me. Like, what makes something Christian music, right? It's a very different world right now, I think, than even 10 years ago when we were talking, where even like if you look at the Western Canadian Music Awards or some of the national award prizes, they sort of lump this whole spiritual music. So obviously it's opened up, but Christian music has like deep roots in literally the music industry in America, and Nashville being one of the ground zeros of the music industry, and where a lot of that came from. I find it interesting. Like, do you feel like you sort of got embraced or introduced, or could just do the gospel thing because of your family, as much as whether or not
totally.
It almost, like you said, the lyrics weren't some version of an overtly Christian message. You weren't, it wasn't worship music adjacent, which is where a lot of that industry had started shifting at that time, away from just regular artists, right? Like singing about their own stories and everything. The machine kind of got taken over by, it had to be worship music.
For sure.
Like church, group, congregational singing, blah, blah, blah. So do you feel like that entry point, was it really just about, this is everything I've known, so this is the first front door that's easy to go through?
Yeah, for sure. I always wanted to do secular music, right? But I don't think, like, looking back, if I listen to that first album, I'm like, this is no more spiritual than like a Father John Misty record or anything. Like, it's literally just it's not that it's purposefully vague. It's just talking about life, and it's reflective of where we were at. And I don't think it's alienating in a way that modern day worship music would be clearly for like one person, and one
point.
belief, right?
I agree. I think interestingly, an observation of mine is that it usually has so little to do with the lyrics, and half the time you can just spot it by presentation. Like they look Christian, they behave Christian, they sort of talk
totally
Christian. And not to make that feel like a pejorative, it's just like anything else. Like there was a version of, this is how you fit in. This is how people know what you are.
Yeah.
This is how you differentiate yourself. So it's no different than a scene somebody, right, might be coming out of in their region of North America. You act and look a certain way.
Totally.
Everybody associates flannel with Seattle and the 90s.
Yeah.
And
everyone has a scene, right?
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I guess here's the part that I'm really curious about you, Jared, because that's, again, you sort of humorously hinted at, like, I was more interested maybe in doing secular music. In other words, you didn't want to be confined or limited, because that scene liked to limit themselves, right? They like to sort of put boundaries, say these people are these people are ours. And
For
so
sure.
you inevitably have to make some move, maybe a more drastic move, to get out of it. And I'm wondering what that experience was like for you. Like, where in the journey of, you released the first record in 2014, you do the first peak performance, before you sort of came back to the second peak performance with a stylistic change, but you were also having to make I'm guessing, some version of a conscious choice on how you were going to not be limited by that scene.
Yeah, I think a big turning point for us from that scene was we had released Wherever We Go, which was our first album, and randomly someone from Factor heard it and then sent it to Chris Winters, who was the director at Alberta Music. And then that's how we found out about the peak. So another like random moment that just pushed us there. And it felt, and it simultaneously, we did a couple church gigs, and we were even denied from one because we weren't overt enough. Like, they canceled it last minute.
You weren't Christian enough.
Yeah, exactly. And it just felt so obvious, and stylistically, like actual genre, the switch from peak, the first time we entered the peak performance, and the second time, that's really who I am. The first time, everyone was stomping and clapping and playing banjos, and there was that 3-4 year period where it's like that was the trend. And if anything, I felt like that was us following a trend.
That's interesting. I mean, you came out basically, like, so 2013, like Mumford & Sons' second album, Babel, like, was a 2012. Yeah. Which pretty much cemented this entire trend of, you're right, like the folk pop rock stompers and banjos and cool beards and all that stuff. So it definitely was an easy lane to be in, but you're saying you knew even while you were doing it that wasn't fully you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, everything that I'd created before was more rock leaning.
Yeah. So
it was, I don't think it was a conscious choice. I think it's just like anyone getting swept up in the time, right? Like, I think we talk about following trends like it's some conscious decision, but usually I think it's just, you're following, like, you just get swept up in it, right?
Yeah, I agree. I guess my observation is, you're right. Like, this sweeping up is essentially, you follow what you like. And when you do it, you stop looking.
It's not like I didn't like it.
No, it's, you stop looking behind you or to the right or left.
Yeah.
So you can't do all the things, and just following things you liked just inherently means you let other things go, probably. But so I guess my question then is around you. Did it feel like there was risk for you?
Switching?
In switching? Did you, like, because you had been in this small, but a version of a steady rise of validation, of people affirming what you're doing, people getting interested that you didn't even know about and sending you music to somebody. So those things, like, were you feeling risky, or were you sort of completely impervious, like it wasn't on your radar?
No, it was hard. We released our first song that was kind of different, and when we took down the other album, we had people that wrote and were upset with us for doing that, and we had even industry people be like, "What are you doing? This isn't who you are," and that really hurt, because they didn't know me. They maybe talked to me once or twice. I think times have changed, though. Like, when I listen to new music Friday or whatever, not like the playlist, but anything out, it's so apparent that every album is just genre mashups. Like, whatever you want to create, like, it's out there. And you have artists that will do a country album one album, and the next record they're doing a pop record, and it's I love it. Like, I love that there's not that boundary anymore, and all of a sudden you're a sellout if you change. Like, maybe I'm not a sellout, I just literally want to try something else. And
I mean, I'd love to earmark that and remember to come back to that, because I think there's an interesting observation about, like, that genre jumping and stuff. It sort of confirms how much more important the producer is sometimes in this whole process. Than where some artists' authentic inspiration and ability lies, which I think is an interesting conversation. But I want to make sure I don't lose a different thing first, which is...
For sure.
So, I mean, that risk musically of your transition, but I'm hoping you'd be willing to talk about what risks you might have been feeling personally, being so tapped into a Christian community and making choices, which you've already alluded to, how people respond if you do something secular. People have a wide range of, like, black and white lines in how they interpret these things when they belong to, like, Christian communities. And you had a lot of support, you had a lot of family history. I'm just wondering what version of risk you were feeling in that community by making some of the choices and changes you were making.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like we're becoming a drastically different and contentious band in a way that would offend anyone.
It's not like you were a Disney kid all of a sudden showing up in, like, scantily clad clothing to distance yourself from your childhood.
So there wasn't that, but there is always a little bit of the crowd that, my family would be involved with, following, your career, and that's fine, but it is a different, of course that's fine, but it's just, it is weird, because they're always looking at you through that lens, and I'm sure that's for everybody, right? Like, you're trying to be serious as an artist and present yourself, and to them, you're that kid that was picking their nose in church, and and you'll always be that, and that's fine. Like, so there is a certain point, like, I think I did struggle with that for a while, but where you just kind of learn to be stoic about it and just be like, this doesn't matter, none of this matters, I just need to do what's important here.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say, like, your parents are obviously ridiculously supportive. I don't go to a show I don't go to a Royal Foundry show without seeing your parents there too, which is fantastic. So also maybe because I only see you in Edmonton, but I'm sure they're not following you
but
around
they're there at every Edmonton one.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, you can be as transparent as you want to be, but I'm definitely interested, Jared, about, like, for you personally, is there a period of time happening in this where you're also unsure of your own personal spiritual choices or how you want to live that out in your life that gets a lot of pressure from an upbringing? I mean, I know with Beth's the pastor's kid, preacher's kid. I'm a preacher's kid. I worked in a church for a while. I chose to stop. I'm asking these questions because I experienced people disappearing really quick from my life. When I did those things, I experienced people asking questions of, to be blunt sometimes, of like, do you feel like you're going to hell now that you've stopped all these things? Like people who just are pretty black and white. But I knew that internally they saw some external choices. They had no idea internally like how much I was pulling all those threads apart on the belief system I sort of was handed. And it made it hard when I was making career and life changes visibly in front of people. Yours is being a band, you're performative, you're visible in front of people all the time, you're public. I'm wondering, were you going through personal changes and questions that sort of also motivated those choices apart from the musical ones, or was that a part of the challenge at all?
Not then. Like, I think if anything, I think people are becoming more open-minded now. Maybe that's social media, the fact that like now you can't even be in your own group, like you're going to see everyone's opinion generally. And that creates a little bit more open-mindedness in all belief systems, which I think is a good thing. But I think if anything now, like if people are gonna get upset about something that we do or say, or a swear word in a song or something like that, then it's like, well, don't listen. Like, it's fine. Move on. There's a bajillion. How many songs are released every week? Like, I pick one.
I mean, it's great that you come to that point of being able to allow it to be their problem and not yours. I guess that's a part of a question I don't think I ever asked you before and has always been on my mind, which is why I wanted to ask it. I remember a point, my dad, again, being a preacher, and for those who get this speak, and I apologize if anybody doesn't get this speak, but I was contemplating what he labeled universalism, which is maybe there isn't some version of like the only way to quote unquote get into heaven, if that even is the main goal anymore, is only believing this one version of a story of Jesus dying, and you have to accept all of that, like that narrow gateway to go through. That was like me coming out of the closet. I don't have a authentic coming out of a closet story. I can't actually claim the terminology. It's probably not right of me, but that's what it felt like to me, because it was my dad and I had to tell him, I don't know if I feel the same way anymore. That one was probably the hardest. So I think I've always thought about that with you guys, just knowing you're making some pretty big changes. So
it's, I mean, there's differences of opinion that we have now and on some things, and it's but my parents are very, very accepting, and I mean, like I'm Beth and I are still Christian, but I think where we're starting to lie and change is you start looking at some of the teachings and you compare it to North American Christianity, and you go, what is this weird conservatism, always vote right, capitalistic, materialistic version that's like, if you were to read it without growing up in North America, you would never think that.
That's a great point.
It's just so different. So that's something that, like, I struggle with now and finding that balance. But
that's I think the point of, like, if you looked at it through a different lens is pretty huge. I had been listening to this podcast where this cultural evolutionist, I can't remember if that's the right term, this author, incredible insight, but he just talked about it almost like anthropologically of the move when in Europe it split between West and East, right? And the East became really orthodox and traditional, and the West followed like the Luther thing, and that basically spilled over to North America and the settlements, and it got married to capitalism, like he said.
Yeah, it's
and literally
weird.
The formation of what we call the nuclear family came from religious influence on changing the rules on who could and couldn't be together, and narrowing down what that unit looked like, married with capitalist and economical requirements of the time. So looking through a different lens has definitely been helpful. But I don't mean to spend forever on that, but I think you have a unique experience and probably a unique story to tell in that way for, I think, anybody who has sort of inherited whatever they inherited growing up, and then has to go through a phase of making their own choices. So,
and everyone has to go through that. Like it's not just religion based. I mean, everyone, like, what are you going to do as a parent? Like, your kids are going to learn what you believe. You can't be so open-minded that they just learn nothing to believe. Like, it's gonna rub off. At some point, I think every kid needs to go through that and evaluate and go like, okay, now that I'm done growing up, what do I actually believe?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Well, let's keep going where you are on the journey, because like you mentioned, like the change coming back to your second year of Peak Performance Project, which again was this sort of limited career window of opportunity where this program would run, and the radio stations need to invest money in their local community whenever they when they get a new license, if anybody doesn't know how that works. So the Canadian government basically mandates that and it's to the tune of like $700,000 a year for 7 years that they have to commit to the local community. They do it in lots of ways. Great organizations like your Provincial Music Association here in Alberta. It's called Alberta Music, and it's like, Music BC or Manitoba Music. All these, they have historically, they got a lot of funding to keep afloat from new radio stations. There's really no room for new radio stations. But the Peak having formed out of somebody who said, what if we took that money and pitched a program for developing artists where we literally send them to school? Because there's no school for being an artist anymore. There's only apprenticeship. Anyhow, so you went through the first year fresh off as a folk duo. And my recollection of that, although I adored you guys, is you got absolutely shit on. Like, you got hammered. I thought you got judged really harshly. I'm wondering, when you think back, is that how you felt about it? Is that how you still feel about it? How do you look back to that first
I didn't feel it was that harsh, so now I want to hear your stories. But
well, I'm glad.
But no, I felt more responsible. Like, I felt like we were ill prepared, but it's a great thing we got to go twice, because the first time was like, yeah, this usually works in church. I think it'll do well here. And then, just no.
Yeah, I think you were...
It's a different language.
You were trying some things, which I admired. Right? You guys you started experimenting with the, like, we're going to play tracks on stage with some stuff too in that time, I remember. And that didn't actually work out super well, but I'm glad we laugh about it now. But I just remember that jury judged you guys really hard. And I was part of that jury, and I remember feeling like, holy shit, I hope this doesn't crush them, right? Because I mean, this is, I think, a big common thread for people who are aspiring to be musicians to hear, is that our perception of bands that are on a trajectory, like, there's moments that are like soul crushing and take you down so many notches. And, I think the best part of a story is how we pull ourselves back up, right? So, interesting to me is that you guys came back a second year, and I remember feeling excited about that. I'm guessing that I probably should have put two and two together. That's why you obviously didn't feel as horribly crushed from the first year of judging, that you felt like we can apply again. And not everybody can get in when they apply a second time. I should make a note when that happened. And you guys did it. You go on to win second place in 75 grand. And that was quickly followed up by the Running Away song, which was a very clear departure from what you were before. And it gets picked up by the CFL for a new style of promotion that they're doing on TV. What was going on in that time and that change? Like, were you feeling unsure about your choices at all? Or were you just literally running fully convinced, like, this is what I need to do?
Oh, fully convinced. Once we got into the peak again, we were very, very determined. And I think if we were at that level and it was our first peak, I don't think we would have done as well, because we had this sort of chip on our shoulder from losing out so bad the first year, at least from judges and stuff. But yeah, no, and from there, I would say Running Away was definitely our, you have ups and downs throughout your career, but that was our biggest trajectory to making us, a little bit of a name for ourselves and being able to build off of that. So from then on, it was like we got second place on the peak, which, I mean, you get second place, but it feels like first place when it's $75,000. Like,
there's no losing.
Great feeling.
That's ridiculous.
And that was right after that, I think a year later, we signed a publishing deal, and just radio was doing good. So everything was lining up there, and it was like, okay, I stopped producing people, and we just kind of got rid of all our anchors, and we're like, let's just do music, which is a scary thing, right?
Yeah. Okay. I'm really glad.
Inconsistent.
I'm really glad you said that, because I think, honestly, like, I put my cards on the table. I really hope that people will listen to this podcast who are aspiring musicians. And I think a lot of the conversations I want to have are for their benefit, to sort of pull back the veil. And I think everyone struggles with when do I jump off on this belief, right? When do I make that transition change? When do I stop the part-time job? And you hear like all these opinions. I don't know how you feel. Like, I started to get so tired of hearing keynotes or sessions at the festivals or conferences of people who would give you could go to a back-to-back session and get the exact opposite advice of you should keep your daytime job as long as you can. And other people say nobody's going to believe you're for real and work with you until you show that you're serious and quit your day job and pursue music. But it's so different for everybody. What was behind that feeling? Again, talking about a risky choice and a risky feeling. What did that look like? Let me put it this way. What were you hanging your hat on? Like, what was it? Version of success? Was it some version of the charts, signing these, contracts with some people to now build a team? What were the things that led you to feel like, let's hang our hat here? Yeah,
I mean, we, in hindsight, like, everything worked out, but we probably jumped off too early, but it was a good thing. Like, radio was going well. We just signed a publishing deal. We just signed with a manager, just signed with a booking agent, all within, I don't know, maybe 3 months, 4 months. So all that happens to you at once. You start to feel really good. Like, there's some real momentum. And now looking back, now I recognize that, like, there's total hot spots and cold spots and times that you're going to have big swings like that, and you're like, oh my goodness, we're doing amazing. But now if we get a big swing, I'm like thankful, but like, no, just chill out. It's fine. Like, this is just, save it for a rainy day. Like, there'll be a bad season too. It was good that we jumped off, because as soon as we lost that anchor, then we were able to, I don't know, then it's feast or famine. Like, you have to make a living out of your music, which does force you to just go for it.
So
like,
did you feel that, was that like a real palpable sense of change for you, of when you're forced to now hustle to keep paying the bills.
Yeah.
Was that a real noticeable like shift just in how you worked together as a team, as a couple? Because it's like, it's not just you, like that choice is you together, and the choices you have to make just as a couple, right? And just how you're going to live and all that. So that brought about like a real specific change. And so like you like you mentioned, like you ran like, even if I look back at like even the last 4 records, right? You said you have to start making some choices. So again, going back to I feel like you guys are a great model of DIY. What were some of those choices, and how do they come about? Like, how does TV commercials come about? How does the obvious like song placement in television or movies stuff, how does that develop? How do you get those doors open? And I guess a real great question that I think a lot of people love to hear is like, how much of a role does that play in your income to survive?
For sure. Initially, it was the biggest part of our income, probably. Those doors opened once it felt like fluke. I feel like I would be dishonest if I said this was the plan that we followed and that's what got us syncs. There was a bit of randomness to it, and that was someone from this publishing company reached out and they were sent something from someone else. It's stuff that you can't control. And that's how we got our first sync for a Purina puppy chow commercial. And so to say that there was like, oh, we followed this plan and then got it would be disingenuous. But yeah, I think what we did learn from that is that, especially today as an independent musician, like you really do need to tap all the streams of revenue, because you need to be going after sync, you need to be doing the live show, you need to be going after radio because there's sound exchange and all that sort of stuff. And if you're not doing all of it,
how much does radio play in?
Commercial radio isn't very much, but it is the momentum builder for us, for sure. Like that's probably, like we always thought TV syncs would be like a big discovery point. Like I remember we met with someone that worked at Shazam, and we like made sure that our song was properly being received in the commercial, because like it was mixed lower in the mix. So we're like, can we submit a version of that commercial so that you can redirect it to our song so people can discover it? And it was like nationwide, played 3 years in the US. Like it was a pretty big sync, and would have had a lot of eyes and ears on it, but the discovery was so low, and we thought it'd be much bigger. But radio has always been a great source of discovery. So
that's a good point. I mean, I work in digital marketing. I have for a number of years, right, where the whole idea is this idea of the funnel that people go through, and the top of the funnel they call awareness. And I think a lot of people would, in interpreting that into music, I think a lot of people might have assumptions that the fact that you're always charting, that you're being played on like the local stations around here, like quite a bit. Like I hear you all the time that there's some version of a pretty good compensation on the other side. Probably isn't as true as they think, but it's doing the other work for you, as you said, of trying to drive attention to what you're doing. Yeah, I mean, you guys you've frequently entered the songwriting contests. You've won a couple of times. Was that again just I've tried this before with some success when I was a teenager? So is this just another avenue to try to pay the bills? And
yeah, for sure. It's just another. There's a part of me that's always wondered, should I stop submitting? Like we were talking with another band, and there's a point that they felt like it looks unprofessional to submit to some of these songwriting competitions. And whatever, they had their reasons. I understand where they're coming from, but mine was always just revenue stream. So I still submit, and it's, a lot of people don't win, obviously, but we've had a pretty good track record. And if it's $30 and you win 1 out of 10, I mean, it's still worth it. I think some of them are kind of, I don't think they're overpromising, but I think people think that if, you know, I'm trying to think of an example, because they have these celebrity judges, right? Like they think if this person's listening to your music, then you're going to make it big time. And that is not true. They are listening to it maybe 30 seconds and then nothing happens. Maybe you move forward. Like, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like, think about it this way, right? Is like I think the new version that we've been in for probably a decade, so not that new, of this like quick fame is like the American Idol model now. There's so many singing competitions. What people are trying to do is everyone's just trying to skip a whole bunch of steps on the ladder on their way to the top. Yeah. And we keep getting fed so many stories of people that it happens for or works for, that we put a lot of effort into it. I think what I see from you and Beth is at some point you sort of found that you're like, well, this is the balance on how you actually make a career out of all this. When do you feel like along the way out of these records, when do you feel like you really settled into knowing what that was? Like, this is what a career looks like for us right now. Or you don't
we don't feel settled. It's still nervous. There's still moments where you're like, is this year gonna be okay? Like it still feels like a gamble at our level. The only thing that we're going off of is the faith that it worked last album, and so things will probably come in, hopefully, maybe, and that's I know that isn't very inspiring, but that's the risk. That's the like not having an anchor, and the reality that like for some people, if they work part-time and have music, that probably works amazing for them depending on what you're doing. But for us, I think if I started working another job, I think it would take away mentally and my energy to do this, and then it would fizzle out. And that's not for everybody. Like, that's why I think that answer, you know, you talking about going to a festival and hearing two different opinions, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just, I think the mistake that people make in receiving that news and people make in giving that news is that it's not for everybody. Like, it's a personal advice. Everyone has a different journey and what will work for them. And to assume that there's one size fits all, like people are being discovered on TikTok randomly or through some random video, and that's how they blow up. And sure, if like some Cinderella moment happened, we would welcome it. But it is funny how the industry, like most of these times when someone blows up, if you dig a little deeper, like Chapel Row, and everyone's like, overnight success, industry planned, all this stuff, and it's like, no, she's been working at it for a long time. Like, what are you talking about?
Well, I remember the very first, like Kelly Clarkson, right? First Idol winner.
Yeah.
And I remember when finally, and it was a lot of years later, and it was the same deal with Carrie Underwood, I believe, of people saying, actually, they've been in LA slinging their demos around for 4 years. They didn't come from nowhere. Everybody already knew who these people were, right? So they landed in a place of opportunity, right? Which sounds a lot sort of how you've described a couple of these moments in your career of you keep doing the work.
It's funny because everyone wants that story of overnight success, like it's a better story. And I think Malcolm Gladwell, the author, had this thing about it, like how we love the dark horse. He's why? That's insane. Like, you should like the team that like worked hard all season and
absolutely
put in the reps to succeed.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, sincerely, I'm glad you pointed that out, because that's literally my motivation for these conversations, which is I think the life of pursuing music has a very different look to it, and it has a lot of looks based on who I talk to. And I think that's important for people to see and to know you and know where you came from and appreciate more the effort you've made to try to build a career over 10 years now. Yeah. Like, I think, you know, a couple of things that we've sort of already talked about. One, your upbringing and surroundings meant that you got a head start on understanding the business and aspects of the business, which most people have to either learn and be scrappy, or they start dying or surviving on grants or some way to pay other people to do these things for them because they don't understand. And you sort of had some of that in your tool belt. And even along the way, you've either made the choice because, I don't know, is it because you guys want the artistic control to make all your own videos, or is it also a financial choice, or because that just Beth is really good behind a camera and has a creative vision maybe? So there's factors, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors. Creative control is a huge thing. We like collaborating with people, and we've done it many times before, but it's also, you're married, you live in the same house, you can easily shoot something on the weekend or whenever, and there is
that's
something nice to that.
I think it has helped define your brand, whether it was fully intentional from the start or not. It has clearly become part of the brand of who you guys are. So do you feel like, having had the upbringing, having the opportunity to go through a development program like you did, and learn what you've learned, and sort of understanding the business side of music, what do you feel has changed the most right now? What is just completely different than it was 10 years ago on the business side of trying to build yourself as an artist?
Radio is one big one. I would say the impact of our song charting lower on radio 10 years ago made a much bigger difference on streams than it does today. There's a good and bad side to that. The good side is that, maybe there's less curation and more just discovery. But that's not totally true either, because all the playlists are basically the new radio, right? It's like you have to make it on this playlist for your song to do well. So that's the other level of curation. But I think too, it's tough. I feel like it's harder to make money as a musician now than it was 10 years ago in a strange way. But at the same time, it's cheaper to make music and cheaper to make videos. So it's this trade-off. It's like the expectation to do a full-blown music video if you have a single isn't really there, even for larger bands. You don't have to. It can be more about just promoting on TikTok. Anyone with a phone can now, you can make music on your phone with a couple adapters and whatever, and that's amazing. It's cool that everyone's creating, but it is harder. It's diluted. There's way more artists and way more competition for not very many spots.
Not very many spots at all. Very true.
Yeah.
So your latest album, which is still pretty fresh in the world, and the song Famous, is that the one you feel getting the most traction right now?
Yeah, that one's doing really good for us right now.
Okay. It's a great song, by the way. I think it's a really great song. I just all of a sudden in my mind, I was not that my opinion matters at all. You know what it made me think of, actually, Jared? I don't know if you remember, you guys after the peak would send me tracks sometimes to listen to because you were trying new things. And I distinctly remember, and I don't know if it was on Running Away or maybe another one, but I was hearing what you were doing, and I was hearing this sort of edge to the synth pop. So it wasn't pop, it wasn't synthy, and I just distinctly remember I was in love with really granular synth sounds. And I remember giving you some version of air quote advice on leaning into this thing. And then I remember later thinking, I don't think they're asking for my creative direction by just sending me some tracks nicely just to get some feedback on. But anyhow, that just made me laugh. I just remember distinctly doing that with you guys.
We were always looking for feedback.
You've done very well in making the choices that you made, the choices for yourself and your musical direction. I'm curious, what's inspiring you right now? When we start, we're generally trying to probably reconstruct the thing that made us love it in the first place when we're young, right? Either I want to be this band.
Yeah.
Right? I want to feel like I could be put on the shelf beside them if somebody were to hear the songs. But that changes over time, and the exposure that you have to all these different artists. What's the thing that's sort of inspiring you, like right now, musically, sonically, how you want to develop your art?
I don't know. There's no specific. No, there's a couple specific artists. I really like Medium Build. Put out this album called Country. It was so good. And it's an example of that kind of genre bending that I'm starting to really like. It definitely has a sound, like in a brand, but it's okay to explore and take people on a journey. And that's the thing, like going back to that genre bending, that's been the most inspiring, is seeing all these artists where you go, like even, is it SZA? Is that how you say it? SZA?
I don't want to be the one to correct you, so we'll say,
okay.
We'll say, yeah, that sounds right.
Her latest album, that was the first time I heard it, where, you know, it's like R&B, hip hop, rap, and then all of a sudden there's just a punk song in the midst of the album, and I loved that. It wasn't even the best song on the record, in my opinion, but it was a breath of fresh air that, you know, we don't need 10 songs that all sound exactly the same, or we're betraying our audience.
Yeah.
And I think there's an appetite for that in everything. Like, same reason there's kind of Marvel fatigue and Disney fatigue. It's like people just want something a little bit different.
Yeah.
Like the formula used to work, but now it's, yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel like, I guess it's not like you're going to go out and write a SZA song.
No.
But you need that to propel you in a different direction and to think about a few things differently, right? Even if that's not where you're going to end up.
For sure. And that's been the biggest stretch for me, and I'm still trying to unlearn that, because I think growing up with gospel music, that CCM world is very structured and like melodically even, and trying to make something catchy, and that's great. I think that taught me like how to make really catchy little licks and melodies, and that's great. But I think I'm having to unlearn that, and have been unlearning that for the past 10 years, and want to unlearn it more, just to be free to like, like we don't need to do verse, chorus, bridge, chorus every song. Like I can just drop out and do something completely different. It's this idea that if it doesn't follow the formula, then no one's gonna like it. But I'm finding now that that's changing, and the appetite seems to be like, no, if you just do something totally left field, maybe the people you want to like it will like it, and then the other people will just dissipate, and they can go listen to formulaic pop rock if they want. But
where do you land on the, I feel like maybe it's a little controversial between musicians or artists, the stuff that's come out from Rick Rubin's book, where he tells people not to write for the audience, right? Like you write it for yourself only. It feels like that doesn't pay the bills, and I'm wondering, like, is that something?
There's a balance.
You wrestle with?
I think every record still needs a couple hits, a couple songs that people can tap their toes to. Like there is something, if you're gonna, there's a balance. Like you can't always be dropping the formula and just throwing everything out the window. Like that's cool for a few songs, but every now and then people want something. There's a balance between like wanting something new but something familiar, and packaging it in a way that feels fresh but safe. And I think that sounds sad to an artist, but it is a reality of trying to make something that you can sell. Like no one's gonna hum your 13-minute prog rock song, and if you find your 13-minute prog rock people, I'm one of them, that's great, but very few people do.
I guess, and in more like mainstream terms, maybe only Taylor is going to get away with a 13-minute version of All Too Well or whatever that song. So you have to earn a certain stripe to get there. So do you have an example like of one of your songs, either on the recent album or other, that you feel really captures you stepping into a more freedom in the structure, like you were talking about, of how you approach a song or build a song and letting some of the old stuff go? Is there a song that really captures that for you?
Yeah. I'm not sure when this podcast is coming out, but in the new year. Okay.
Yeah.
We have a song coming out in the new year called I Don't Want to Talk, and it's the album that we just put out is actually part one of a 2-part EP album, and the whole second half of that album is much more experimental and I think strays quite a bit from some of the Royal Foundry conventions. That song being one of them, I Don't Want to Talk. That just, like there's something a little bit folksy to it, but then willing to go full throttle rock partway through, and it was kind of freeing to make something like that. To kind of, you talking about trying to maybe not emulate your favorite artist, but like that's who inspires you. And there's something that I think as you start making your passion your career, it's really easy to lose that childlike wonder of like the first time you accidentally do a pinch harmonic and you're like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And that sort of discovery. And I think that album has been all about trying to like write, that sounds weird, but like write like a teenager, write with fresh ears, right? And,
I don't think that sounds weird at all.
Yeah.
I think that's a really great point to make. I think if you've been doing it as earnestly and full-time as you have been doing, I think it's pretty obvious how easy it would be to kind of lose your way in that. And so whatever version, I think every band that has longevity has a time and a version that probably becomes obvious down the road when they were doing exactly what you just described, right? It's like, I need to go rediscover something to keep this going. So,
and maybe that's to Rick Rubin's point, at least to some degree, is like, that's writing.
It's
for
not
yourself.
either or,
like,
right?
Yeah,
it's maybe both and.
And if you're good at writing for yourself, then people will like it. But to assume that you just write for yourself and it'll be great,
yeah. I mean, altruism is really difficult, especially as an artist, right?
Yeah,
and to say
sure.
that, you sort of joked about it at the very beginning. Like, do any of us, we're writing a song that satisfies and scratches some itch deep inside of us. That's what's happening every single time. I'm changing the voicing of a chord because it's scratching melancholy, right?
Yeah.
But it's impossible to divorce that from, I hope somebody else feels the same thing I just felt. And for whatever reason, because we felt it so strongly when we were being influenced and growing up and shaping ourselves around the music we were consuming, it feels so important that somebody else has that same experience with what I make, right? So,
but that's the cool thing about the new music industry, is that it doesn't happen for everyone, but you certainly have the potential to write that niche thing that feels so personal and scratched your itch. And like before, it would have to go through gatekeepers and no one else would find it because it didn't hit the formula. But now there's always a chance that you could find your people that are like, oh, that's my favorite thing.
Yeah, and I think that's really the thing, is like, whether it was the narrow set of gatekeepers or curators, or now it's the algorithm, and however you feel like, if you want to just do this to make success and make money, whether it was then or now, you're going to pursue that with a lot more of your time and energy versus what you just described, which is the sense of finding your people, which I think is pretty incredible. Do you feel like right now at 10 years, like you've found your people, or do you feel like that's still evolving? Do you feel
feel like there's more people out there, but I do feel like we found some of our people, and we're just waving our flag. No, we're putting up a banner saying, here we are.
Yeah. That's awesome. Okay, well, I really appreciate you taking the time to do
I
this,
really appreciate being on.
Jared. I've always loved your story along the way and been able to feel like I've been, only at arm's length from it, like pretty close to it. It's been pretty great. I've obviously got a lot of musician friends and whatnot, but I've always felt, like I said at the start, pretty good affinity with what you guys do. I think being just genuinely really great people in the industry consistently over 10 years is maybe one of the things I appreciate the most. So, and you taking the time out to do this is pretty great for me. So I appreciate it. And you're going to have to give my best to Beth wherever she is, hands full with a little one.
Yeah, hands full.
So before we leave, then looking into the new year, this second half of this project is there a target for when that come out what we look forward to?
Yeah, spring, March, April.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And get some releases out in advance to get it rolling. Well, Jared, I appreciate the time and I look forward
Thanks so
to
much
when
for
I
having
get
me.
to bump into you again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. Thanks so much.
Hey, I'm Alexi. Stick around for post fame with me and my dad.
Okay, well, welcome to episode 4, where we are going to talk about the interview with Jared from the Royal Foundry.
Another one that I've met.
Yeah, you have met Jared. I think we mentioned it in the conversation in the podcast as well. But yeah, I do remember Taste of Edmonton. You don't know, but I think you probably don't even realize, because we've taken you to a couple of things like Taste of Edmonton. It's been in a couple of places. And
yeah.
there was also another, I posted a picture this week of myself and episode 2 host or guest Grant Lawrence, right? Kind of posing together, and he's wearing one of his CBC sweaters and I'm wearing a Wheat Pool t-shirt. And it was actually after a performance of the Royal Foundry, and I can't remember what that event was about, but I know it was the Royal Foundry that we were watched and that we talked about after, because they were very fresh, up and coming at that time.
Yeah, tie-in.
A lot of tie-in. You're right. So, but you had a chance to listen to the episode. This one was an audio wrestling match for whatever technical reasons. So I still don't, as we're speaking now, I still don't know what the final outcome of that wrestling match is going to be, but hopefully it'll be good. But
I think good.
you know what stood out in the episode for you? I'm not sure how much you've listened to their music before, but
I've heard a little bit. I've heard you play a little bit, and I've definitely went and looked myself. They're not in my daily rotation the same way, like even Dan was. But good. I don't know. There was kind of 2 main things that stood out, and one I'm not going to get into because this will make 10 minutes go into 10 hours really fast. But and that was the whole like kind of talk of like religion and how you guys dove into kind of that topic relation to like music and music careers. But the other one was when you guys were talking about like when to take the leap. As soon as you guys were talking about that, I was just like, oh, that's just such a vague spot in like a music career. Like you just never hear about it other than like when you watch like The Voice or one of those shows and it's like, oh yeah, a year ago I quit my full-time job and now I'm pursuing music full-time. And that's like, yeah, but that's the extent of it. Like you hear that and then
you're saying you never hear about that or hear that part of the story. You sort of assume there's been one steady straight line to get to where you finally heard about them. Because I think in the first episode with Dan Mangan, we talked maybe a little bit about it as well, because that's a big part of his story when he decided, and it became sort of iconic in song because he wrote about the experience of driving down to South by Southwest, and that was a big part where he sort of had to decide, right, am I going to jump off and do this full time? But the Royal Foundry is another version of that for sure is big.
I mean, Dan's conversation was more like, I took the jump and then, he was saying how he's still doing so many aspects for himself and kind of still on that grind. Whereas like the Royal Foundry was like it was just very like raw and like, oh, you take the jump and then it's like, here's how much income is like actually being made and like, here's how hard, you have to work and here's all these other like alternative routes you have to do. And then I remember when he had said that like it had been like however extent of time since
Mm.
they took that jump, and it still doesn't feel like settled in is the term he used. Like he still doesn't feel settled in whatsoever. And I
Yeah,
just think that's really
maybe.
interesting.
Do you think he was inferring that maybe he still doesn't feel comfortable?
Yeah,
Like
that's what
if
I
you're
think
in
it was.
like when you're in a job, right, and you've been there for 6 months, and you're like, this still
Yeah,
feels like I'm the new guy, or something.
yeah,
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it was, to be honest, now that you say that, I recollect during the conversation that I kind of maybe even wished for more detail. It would be great in some of these conversations to pull out even like nobody's going to tell me how much they're probably actually making, but it would sometimes be kind of nice to see, right? Because he is supporting like all the things that they support themselves with, trying to
yeah,
win songwriter competitions or writing jingles for South American people or whatever it may be, and how well the record does or doesn't do from one to the next. And they keep trying to refine that.
mhm.
But you're right. You don't ever hear about when does that artist or when did that artist actually have to take that very life risky, you know, leap, whatever you want to call it, right?
Yeah, or even that like I feel like when you hear about it a lot of the time, it's like I made that jump and then here's all these things that have gone really well and here's these things I've flourished in where he said, I took that jump and then it was kind of do or die. I forget the phrase he used, but it was basically like you succeed or you starve, like, and that what
Yeah.
like is what
Yeah.
becomes
That's a good
very
point.
apparent. And it's like I think that he was just very like raw with his truth. Like you don't hear a lot of people
Yeah.
who have taken this big risk, and like he has succeeded in taking that risk, but that wasn't his point. His point was like, yeah, it's not an easy thing, and it's not very like it's not like not a fun thing, but it's like it's a hard thing to do. And while it's like a great thing, there's like all these like
Yeah.
hard choices and
It
parts of
was
it.
just more clear how you could be doing the thing you love and still not sure how it's going to pan out tomorrow, every
Yeah.
single day, right? That's definitely a palpable feeling from that. Well, I mean, you wanted to skip over the religion thing, but and that's fair because I think my when I left that conversation, I was like, did I think I talked about that for too long. I don't know what your thoughts
I
were.
don't
If
think you
like
did. I think it was I think it was really interesting. I mean, I might be biased, but no, I think it was really interesting. I wrote down, let me see, I texted it to myself when you guys were talking. Oh, and you guys were just saying like that when you like grow up or like if you are raising kids, like, what's like deflected off of yourself, like just as an individual. And I think it was like a really interesting point. Because even just like my friends and I have talked about like, religion and spirituality in and of ourselves. And like if we were raised in the church, like, and are no longer going to church, if we had a kid, that we would probably want to still raise them there or not. And it's
yeah,
a kind of really interesting question when you're in that place. And I've discussed it in like such detail with people. And there's like a way that you guys phrase it that just like hit a chord in my brain of like, oh, I haven't thought about it that way. And it was when Jared said, what are you going to do as a parent? Your kids are going to learn what you believe. You can't just be so open minded that they learn nothing to believe because that's going to rub off as well.
mm,
And it's like this really interesting point of like, and it
mm,
just got me thinking because it's like, your spirituality that rubs off on me, like your music taste that rubs off on me, like, and if you choose to like take no stance and be like an open
yeah.
slate and just like a clear
There
slate,
isn't
like
a
that,
version of a non sequitur there. It's one
yeah,
or the other. It's the other side of the coin. I think that's a great observation. I didn't think about it, but yeah, he's basically pointing to that the other side of the coin exists, right?
mhm, yeah,
But yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting, even the way you phrased it beforehand about, go whatever version of church it is, and the way he talked about, well, just the, what are you going to do with your kids, and maybe the fact that the reality of how you were raised can sometimes go away for a while, right? When you start to become
right,
independent, really the age you're at now, right, where you get to start making choices for yourself, but then people who have kids, maybe that's when that comes back and they start to think about it. And of course, the
mhm,
complexity for them is, I think two things. Both, how do you raise a kid as a full time rock and roll band? I don't know. There's not a lot of blueprints around it. There's not anybody on
Yeah.
any block we've lived on, right? That was always me, I guess. I guess I was the guy
Yeah.
who was doing that for a long time. So maybe that's why I can really relate to him that way. But I think I just felt like in everything I've seen or read about them, nobody's ever talked about his lineage. And
Mhm.
I get that there's a real bias to my own experience and my own life and my own upbringing, which is why me and him and Beth connected in the first place, right? Which was a little
Yeah.
unfortunate, by the way, that Beth couldn't be on the call too, to we have both of them for the Royal Foundry, but I was glad we had Jared. But yeah, I just would have loved that. But I wanted to sort of just dig into his perspective on how that lineage sort of played out. Because if you think about it, it's easy sometimes for us to talk about in music some of the normal roadblocks or barriers of, for example, we live in Western Canada, right? And a couple of the people I've already talked to, how the Canadian music industry is so Toronto based. And so out
Yeah.
here, there's a constant struggle of, do I have to move? Do I have to leave everything behind? Do I have to sort of start over and try to succeed in a new scene or community and not have all my supports? And I think for people who are given a lot of advantages musically, if they grow up in a church, especially certain styles of churches where music is so readily available, the thought of, if I don't want to be locked in that box, I'm going to have to start over with a whole new
Yeah.
community at the bottom of the ladder and work my way up again. Whereas if I stayed in this box, I've got a built in community support system and all that kind of stuff. Right.
Yeah.
But okay, I won't go on about that whole thing. But the one part that I did think I was going to bring up, the one because I needed to ask you, did I talk about it for too long? And here I am probably talking about it for too long again. But I had such a personal, I just had a lot I wanted to dig into. But
Yeah.
uh, I appreciate your perspective. I guess the one thing that I thought about actually while, so yesterday you and I were driving home from Saskatchewan, driving home from the
Yes.
funeral for your grandpa, and it was a very tough
Yes.
weekend. And we had the funeral on Saturday in the church where your mom grew up in, that your parents had belonged to for years. And I think some of the conversation between your brother and myself and some others were like, it just the uncomfortableness of them using the Christianese and the churchanese when your papa was so plain spoken and so
Mhm.
relatable to everybody that wasn't churchy,
Yeah.
that we didn't love that, right? Um, and so I was just, I know I talked a lot about their church background, and I can start to sometimes knock all that really easy. Like I could walk away from that funeral, in the same way I can walk away from the conversations with Jared and his stuff. And you can sort of knock the limitations or the things we don't love about that whole
Mhm.
culture, church culture stuff. And, there's a portion of your life you grew up around it too. But what I did notice from the funeral, and I had to remind myself, is how incredible that community of people can be for all their faults. That the way they stick together, and you saw those people who, uh,
Yeah.
he had affected their life, but they affected his life as well. You know, the way that they just would clear the schedule for his funeral
Mhm.
that day, and then all those volunteers would come in, and they didn't charge anybody to, put on a reception and make all that
Exactly.
food and endlessly be there. Anyhow, it's that part is beautiful, and I think I would be remiss not to point out, for all the times that I am willing to sort of throw a bunch of daggers at the entire thing, I should talk about when we see the beautiful parts about it too, which we did this weekend. And I should be reminded about the positive optimism that Jared had, I thought, about what he took from being part of like a family band growing
Yeah.
up, and the support they're given now, even when they went through this horrible fire and stuff, has just been pretty incredible. So I love that part of the story too. So,
Yeah.
it's funny because like you could totally hear me scratching my beard there. Did you hear that? I'm gonna have to edit
No, I
that
didn't.
out. I can see the meter going up and down when I scratch my beard. Um,
No.
anyhow, let's move on. We can move on for that. I really enjoyed being able to talk to them. I would have loved to also talk to Beth because I really like her perspective. You talk about like Dan doing it all himself. I don't know how much we dove into in that episode, but they are so
And
do
you
it
called it
themselves.
they called it DIY. You guys talked
Yeah.
briefly, but you guys talked about the DIY aspect, which was also interesting because I don't know how he phrased it, but he had a very outward appreciation for the fact that he's been able to DIY his music career.
Hmm.
And I think that's interesting. I think a lot of people who've had to work that hard and have that work come from themselves and their own resources sometimes can just easily bash that and take it for granted,
Mm.
because it's hard. But I don't know. I think he just sounded like he was really like grateful that like he's able to do
Yeah.
that, or the both of them. And I think that's also an interesting take.
So let's quickly to sort of wrap up our little touch base. I wanted to have a little connection to around music because I always like getting your recommendation, and I've had a
No,
big week of some new music. I haven't even absorbed it all, but I'm going to name
what?
the names. So who's going to go
Yeah,
first?
for
You want to?
you?
No, who's going to go first? Are you going to tell me your
Oh, how
current
much do you have?
musical
I got
obsessions?
one song.
Okay, tell me. You go.
Okay. I might butcher the name. Waited Out by Bo Stalock. Stalick? Something.
Probably
That's
Staylock if it's
maybe Staylock, but so good. I was just reading into it, and I was reading the lyrics because I think last episode we were talking about like songs that or maybe the one before, songs that I find and I repeat, and it's like
yeah.
my like I don't know dirty habit of music. Like I'll find a song that itches something in my brain, and then I'll play it 30 times in a week, and everyone gets sick of me. Um, but this was one, and then I actually went and took time and looked at the lyrics because it's a very catchy song, and it's just interesting. It's he's talking about a girl, but like the overall theme of like wait it out is like patience and uncertainty, and like the two things together, like having patience for something that you're like uncertain about or uncertain will or will like not happen. I don't know. I just thought it was really interesting. It's a catchy kind of like light tune, and then you read the lyrics and you really think about them, and you're like, oh, like
Yeah.
And I also thought it
Beat
was
to it.
interesting
Yeah.
in relation to the episode and just like um when Jared was talking about taking a leap in career, like that's something that ties perfectly. Like you have to be so patient with like yourself and your career and like a timeline when you take that leap. Um
Mm.
and there's also just like that uncertainty of like, like what's gonna happen, when's it gonna happen. So I thought that was a good tie
Well,
together for the song I wanted to talk about.
especially the when's it going to happen? Like we're getting less and less tolerant of waiting for the when in
Yeah.
everything these days. So I think
Yeah.
that's yeah, and that's subject I that's great. It's subject matter that doesn't get sort of drawn out in the quote unquote typical relationship love song whatever version that's being spun out, right? So
Yeah.
uh I like that a lot.
Yeah.
I recognized the name because I saw you've already added it to the Spotify playlist. So
Oh, I
uh,
had to.
and if anybody didn't know yet, we do have a Spotify playlist that's public that's under the name Almost Famous Enough, so you can look it up and listen to songs that we talk about here or songs by artists or that the artists or the guests I should say mention as well. So um, I'm gonna go listen to that one for sure because
Yeah.
now you talking about the lyrics and subject matter, that's always gonna get me hooked in to go and check it out. For me, it was a big week of bands that are sort of more recent, top of my list, right? So,
Mm.
um, first one is Inhaler. I had been waiting for their new album to drop. It's called Open Wide. So, Inhaler is a band from the UK. It's the son of Bono of U2. And not 2024, but in 2023, that was the top song of my
Yeah.
2023 playlist. I absolutely fell in love with the album and a couple of the songs on the album. Well, one in particular. and I absolutely love it actually when I can hear the Bono tone in his voice. It's like
Mm.
I loved Bono back when Bono was most relevant with his band, and to hear his voice in a way, in a new way, in a new band that feels more relevant again, without all the weight of it having to be Bono and this bigger than life
Yeah.
personality. Anyway, somehow the mix of that feels so good to me. So I'm hoping this record's great. I know one song off of it is really good so far. I'm gonna put that
Okay.
on the playlist. The second band is called Michigander. It's a self-titled record.
Oh, yes.
Probably heard this through me a lot because they're on
Okay.
my indie bops playlists all the time. Because this guy writes, it's basically one guy, but he goes under the term Michigander, and it's very glossy, as glossy as indie can get, I think, in writing kind of indie pop stuff. But it's like upbeat, it's bangers, it's pretty feel good, even in the song, even though
Yeah.
the songs are kind of sad bastard tunes. So anyhow, I'm hoping that he's continuing a string of really good records too. So the theme here for me is like there's 3 records, and I'm hoping that they measure up to the impact that these previous records have. The last one is Sharon Van Etten, who I think is incredible.
Okay.
And her songs 17 and Every Time the Sun Comes Up are 2 of the
Mm.
best rock songs I've heard in the last decade. I think they would probably be right in the top of any list I make. And so she made a record and called it Sharon Van Etten and the Attachment Theory. So she's doing an experiment where she writes with the band and sort of relinquishes a lot of that responsibility and then kind of honored it by naming the band into it, I guess.
Yeah.
So I listened to that once while we were driving home yesterday, but the weather was bad and things were noisy, and I didn't sink into it, so I'm going to have to listen to that one more. But those are my 3 things I'm fascinated with right now, and I can't wait to get into, and I hope maybe other people check out, and I'll put some of their songs on the
Yeah.
playlist also.
I'll dig
Sound
in
good?
more. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for your time, as
Oh,
always.
yeah, of
Looking forward
course,
to the
for you.
next one.
Yeah, pretty soon here.
Love
Okay,
you.
bye.
Bye bye.
Love you too.